This video is sponsored by Paradox Interactive. Hey everybody, it's PartyElite, and today we're kicking off a beginner's guide series for Victoria 3. In today's video, we'll be looking at some absolute essentials you need to know before you begin, and in future videos in this series, we'll be exploring more topics with varying degrees of depth. If you'd like to see something in particular get covered, let me know down below in the comments, and if you have any questions, feel free to ask them down below too, or in the Discord linked in the description. And don't forget, there's a link in the description and pinned comment you can use to learn more about the game and grab it for yourself as well. Now, with no more time to waste, and with timestamps to jump around as you wish, let's begin. You're working against yourself. One of the most foundational things to understand about Victoria 3 is that your goals will often contradict each other, asking you to make certain sacrifices in the interest of progress towards a goal. Now, over the next 30 seconds or so, I'm about to make some very rapid-fire statements that'll all sound like complete gibberish if you have no idea how to play the game. I just want to reassure you that the rest of this video is spoken at a normal pace, and that I'll actually be going in depth with all the concepts I'm about to mention, but I just felt as though this section was needed up front because of how vital it is to the rest of the conversation. Ultimately, Victoria 3 is a sandbox, but you can't make a sandcastle without digging a few holes in the ground. A perfect example of this is country rank. For many, this would be the key indicator of success, and for all intents and purposes, if it's your priority, you can absolutely make it so. One of the key factors in being a high-rank nation, though, is having a high prestige, and a key factor in having a high prestige, among other things, is having a high GDP. And a great way to have a high GDP is to produce a lot of a very expensive good. But whenever you produce more of a certain good, the price drops, which means you need to export it to maintain the balance between supply and demand. But in order to do that, you might need convoys, and convoys are produced by ports, but ports take money from the nation's treasury to operate, and all of a sudden, you're losing money because you wanted to increase your nation's GDP. To counter that hit to your treasury, you might decide to increase taxes. Consumption taxes or higher tax rates in general are a quick way to make money, but then your population has less money in hand after taxes, and they might not be able to fulfill their needs as a result, leading to turmoil and rebellion. There are sweet middle grounds you can seek out for all of these elements, but before we got further along with this video, I thought it was important to highlight just how counterintuitive certain decisions can seem at times, and while everything I just said might sound like chaotic nonsense to you without context on how it all works and what it all means, I assure you, as you keep watching this video, it'll all start to make sense. With that preamble out of the way, let's get into the thick of things. Understanding POPs. POPs are the major driving force behind everything in Victoria 3. They run the economy, instigate policy changes, fight wars, or rise up for revolution, and as such, they'll come up constantly throughout this video. POPs represent the population of your nation. They are grouped into types that represent the kind of work they do, and they are further divided based on their culture, faith, location, and place of employment. When people take on a new job or move from state to state or adopt a new culture or faith, they move between these groupings. And sometimes, people are able to become a whole new type of POP, moving between these groupings instead. This only happens if the POP in question meets certain prerequisites known as qualifications. This can include a level of literacy, not being of a culture or faith that's discriminated against, having a certain wealth level, and being a certain POP type to begin with. For example, a peasant who used to work at a farm might move to the tooling workshops in the same state for better wages and become an engineer instead. Or perhaps the peasant accumulates enough wealth with which to become a shopkeeper, and then eventually, with enough additional added wealth and literacy, a capitalist. They aren't likely to jump from being a peasant to being a capitalist in one step, as they need to acquire the associated qualifications first, one step at a time. You can promote social mobility to encourage POPs to strive for higher qualifications in a state, you can build universities to help develop qualifications faster in a state, and you can use promote national values to encourage POPs to convert their culture and faith from ones that are discriminated against to more accepted alternatives. Discrimination causes reduced pay, radicalization, and a reduced likelihood of developing qualifications. POPs of different types will have access to different benefits. For example, business owners, typically shopkeepers, aristocrats, and capitalists, will be able to earn extra money through dividends of a profitable business they own, and they'll be able to make money in the form of interest payments if they've lent money to the government. Peasants working on a farm won't have access to such streams of income as you might imagine, but they might have access to subsistence output from subsistence farms they work at, and many lower and middle tier POPs will have their family members making money in the form of dependent income based on your child labor laws, if women can join the workforce, and social welfare policies. These are all marginal additions to what the actual workforce makes, but every penny counts. Richer pop types, meanwhile, don't have access to dependent income because their families aren't taking on odd jobs or getting government support to help make ends meet. Even if they might need it, they would rather use their savings. The income and expenses of a pop help determine their standard of living, largely derived from their wealth, and we'll discuss this in greater depth in just a few moments. Pops are also, rather importantly, able to join interest groups to partake in politics and influence your nation's laws and ideologies. Many pops will be politically inactive due to low literacy or a low standard of living, but keep in mind that a pop group is never entirely the one thing represented here. The tooltip that appears when you hover over the word will show you the breakdown of the interest groups the pop group actually supports, with the majority being the one put on display. Keep in mind that a pop group that is discriminated against doesn't actually give strength to their interest groups, even if they're in one. Now, by clicking into a pop group, you can see their collective political strength, and wielding this strength and the interest groups in your nation is a key aspect of influencing how your nation evolves over time. With that said, let's discuss interest groups and changing laws. Interest groups are the political force that your population uses to demand or fight against change, allowing you to make policy changes as you wish, or starting political movements that try and force you to make policy changes that they want instead. Keeping them in check and empowering the right ones is essential to building the society you want. As described previously, you can see which interest groups a pop is a part of on this screen and on this screen, or you can go the other way around and see which pops are in an interest group from the specific interest groups panel. If you're wondering why certain pops are flocking to a certain interest group, you can see the factors that attract pops to an interest group or perhaps push them away. And if you want pops to join or avoid certain interest groups, you should consider these attraction modifiers. Do you want more pops to join the intelligentsia? Then you need to try and increase literacy levels, and you need to encourage pops to become of a profession that is attracted to the intelligentsia interest group. Do you want more people to join the trade unions? Seek out the appropriate technologies and avoid building agriculture, ranch, and plantation buildings. Each interest group has barriers to entry, and it's up to you to pull them down or put them up depending on which interest groups you want to empower or weaken. You can see which interest groups are present in your nation in the outliner, where they'll be listed as interest groups or marginalized groups depending on their clout, a representation of their actual political power. Each interest group will have laws that they want to see passed, but they also have laws that they'll oppose, all determined by their ideologies. Typically, interest groups with the same name have 3 or 4 ideologies that they share in common no matter where in the world they are, and an additional ideology is added by the interest group's current leader, unless they're a moderate. Interest groups with the same icon might sometimes have different names across nations, and this typically comes with slightly different ideologies. The armed forces in Japan, for example, are called samurai, and though they're mostly similar to armed forces, they also have the Bakufu ideology. Paying attention to these ideologies is extremely important as it determines, as I mentioned earlier, which laws an interest group endorses, doesn't care about, or opposes. Not only is this essential for changing laws, as we'll discuss in a moment, but the approval rating of an interest group is largely determined by how they feel about currently active laws in your nation, and these feelings are especially fervent about recently changed laws, with radicals and loyalists further weighing in on the approval rating of an interest group. Angry interest groups can turn political movements they're a part of violent, while happy interest groups might not join political movements at all, even if they agree with them in theory. The approval rating further determines which traits will be active or inactive. Traits are common across interest groups with that same icon, regardless of name, and the first one is a malice that activates when approval is at or below -5, whereas the other 2 are bonuses that apply when approval is at or above 5 and 10 respectively. The impact of these traits is furthered when the interest group is considered powerful, having a clout above 20%, and on the flip side, if the interest group is considered marginalized with a clout below 5%, these traits have no effect at all. The total clout across all interest groups adds up to 100%, so when one interest group grows more powerful, it's at the expense of others. Clout is calculated based on the sum of the political strength of pops in interest groups, a function of their wealth, with modifiers from technology, laws, leader traits, ruler traits, how many of their members hold positions of power such as generals or admirals, and whether the state they live in is unincorporated, incorporated, or the capital state. Pops in the capital state have more political strength than the standard, while pops in unincorporated states have less than the standard. So make sure to incorporate a state that have pops of your preferred interest groups using the state action to do so. You can even move your capital if you desire. Beyond strengthening or weakening traits, clout determines how easily you can enact laws. To enact a new law, at least one of the interest groups that supports it needs to be in the government. If you want to bring a new interest group into the government, you'll need to reform it, bringing them in. Your legitimacy will be impacted to reflect the laws the newly added interest group wants compared to the currently active laws in your nation, and the higher your legitimacy is, the more quickly you'll see new laws get passed. You'll notice that marginalized interest groups cannot be brought into the government at all, so you'll need to increase their clout to at least 5% before you can even try to enact laws that they want to see passed. Then, even if you've got the right interest group in your government, and you're able to click the enact button, the process of enactment takes time. The time taken between each check is determined by your government's legitimacy as described earlier, and the percentage chance of success when that check happens is determined by the sum of the clout of all the interest groups currently in the government that support the law you're trying to enact, further modified by excess authority and any events that might have happened as you were trying to enact the law. There are more systems to discuss here, but we'll save that for a later deep dive video. For the time being, you can see why clout is so important. You also need to keep in mind that the collective clout of interest groups can be wielded against you, bringing political movements that you don't agree with, potentially causing radicalization, revolution, and civil war. So knowing how to increase and decrease clout is especially valuable. The most straightforward way is to use your authority to bolster or suppress interest groups that you want to empower or weaken respectively, encouraging more pops to join or ignore the interest group in question by adding positive or negative modifiers to its attraction. Another way involves appointing leaders, such as generals and admirals, as they will add to the political strength calculation modifiers for the interest group of which they are a part. Typically armed forces, but sometimes you'll find generals and admirals that are a part of a different interest group. Promoting these leaders to higher ranks increases their modifiers. But the most impactful way to increase or decrease clout is by influencing the wealth of the pops in the interest group. The impacts of wealth and standard of living. The standard of living of a pop is a direct reflection of how satisfied they are with their lot in life. It's primarily dictated by their wealth level, though modifiers can bolster or reduce their standard of living further. Pops typically migrate between states of a nation or internationally within a market, driven by the pursuit of a higher standard of living. If a specific state has a higher average standard of living, pops will be more inclined to migrate to said state, and using the greener grass campaign's decree at the cost of your authority, you can make certain states more appealing for pops to migrate to. Standard of living will fluctuate based on wealth levels and the aforementioned modifiers, and when the standard of living goes up, you can expect some of the pops in that group to become loyalists, though if it goes down, you can expect some of the pops to become radicals instead. Too much radicalization can lead to turmoil, which can negatively impact the output of states in your nation or worse, so you'll want to keep an eye on standard of living, and you'll want to be especially careful that the current standard of living doesn't drop below the expected minimum for each pop group. Apart from that, standard of living impacts birth rates and mortality for the pop group in question as well. Modifiers aside, the most consistent and impactful way in which you can change a pop group's standard of living is by affecting their wealth. If a pop group is collectively earning more money than they're spending every week by a significant enough margin, you'll see them make progress towards the next wealth level up over time. If the net income is a negative instead, you'll see the pop group make progress towards the next wealth level down. The resulting drop in standard of living can cause radicalization and turmoil as mentioned previously, but the reduced wealth level can be used as a tool to strip power away from an interest group you want to weaken. After all, as discussed in the previous section, wealth translates into clout, which translates into what laws can be enacted and how strong any political movements in your nation might be. Similarly, as alluded to in the previous section, you'll want to enrich the pops that are in the interest groups you want to empower. Keep an eye out for factors like consumption taxes. Simply removing these will reduce expenses for pops that use a lot of the taxed product. Grain taxes are very common, for example, adding a huge cost to all strata of society as a way to bolster your own treasury. Removing the grain tax can immediately help your people immensely. Modifying other tax rates can also help alleviate certain expenses, accelerating the rate at which pops obtain a higher level of wealth and, subsequently, a higher standard of living. Increased wealth also gives a pop better access to education, which can in turn increase their literacy, which can further allow them to join interest groups that they might otherwise have ignored. Improved literacy also helps increase the speed and spread of research and technology in your nation. The most involved way you can make a difference to pop wealth while minimally impacting the government's treasury, though, is by ensuring they receive high wages while minimizing the cost of their needs. Government and military employees will have their wages determined by your budget, but private sector employees will get paid based on where they work. We'll discuss this in more detail in the next section. As far as expenses are concerned, if you hover over the wealth level, you'll see which category of needs a pop is trying to fulfill, with higher wealth pops needing more categories of things, and if you go one step further, you can see exactly which goods are being used to fulfill these need categories, again impacted by the wealth level of the pop, but also by any cultural obsessions or religious taboos that drive them to consume or avoid a good respectively. Pops will try to minimize their expenses as best as possible within reason, but to help them along, you'll want to see where most of their money is going, and you'll want to try and reduce the cost of those goods. You can do so by either producing more of said goods locally by building or expanding the buildings which produce them, or you can import the goods instead. Increasing production at home is a great way to provide employment opportunities to your population, but if you're reducing the price of the goods produced at home, businesses in your nation might not be able to make enough money with which to pay their employees a sustainable wage, ultimately keeping things unaffordable for some. Profitability is a major consideration, even when you're trying to make goods cheap for your people to consume. Buildings, production, and profitability. Though there are the rare buildings that you cannot directly commission the construction of, like trade centers and urban centers, almost all others can be built at your discretion to help produce a variety of goods and services that either fulfill your people's needs or enable other buildings to operate. There are some outliers, like the government administration building that produces bureaucracy and helps collect taxes, the university that helps with tech research and pop social mobility, ports that allow you to move goods over sea routes, barracks and naval bases that increase your power projection and military strength, and railways that increase your infrastructure in a state per level, while construction sectors allow you to actually build buildings. Some buildings, like, say, gold mines, can only be placed where the prerequisite raw material is available. A good reason to go to war at times. Other buildings can be placed anywhere as long as you've unlocked the prerequisite technology. Buildings almost universally add urbanization to the state they're being built in, even if you're building a rural building. And every 100 urbanization in a state results in the increase of the urban center size, producing more services and later, transportation, while providing employment and wages. When possible, try not to overburden the infrastructure of a state whose infrastructure is already precariously balanced. Most buildings also use up infrastructure, and if a state doesn't have enough infrastructure to support all of the buildings within, the cost of goods going in and leaving from that state will be negatively impacted, affecting both pops who are just trying to fulfill their needs and the buildings that need to purchase raw materials to function. Using the road maintenance decree on a state will help add to a state's infrastructure while active, and it improves the rate at which construction happens in the state too. When you actually commission the construction of a building, it takes time to build based on how much construction is required to build it compared to how much construction your nation is producing from its construction centers. Building more or upgrading existing construction centers will increase how quickly you can build buildings, as can changing their production methods, and make sure to place construction centers primarily in states where you intend to do a lot of construction to get the further benefit of increased state construction efficiency in that state. Construction centers operate nationally, but that efficiency bonus only applies to the local state. Generating more bureaucracy than you're consuming also helps construction efficiency on a national level. The financial investment for construction is represented by the actual cost in goods and wages at the construction centers, and who pays for it depends partly on how well businesses are doing in your nation, partly on what you're trying to build, and partly on your economic system. Business owners take a portion of the dividends they earn from a profitable building they own and add it to the investment pool. This investment pool is then tapped into when building any of the buildings covered by your economic system. A temporary expense is added to your treasury, but that expense is balanced by the temporary influx from the investment pool through the investment pool transfer. Note that if the investment pool is empty or otherwise runs dry, you can still build the buildings that would normally be covered, except that cost will be deducted from the treasury without the investment pool stepping in to replace the outflow of money. The same applies when building anything not covered by investment pools in the first place. You can still build them, but you have to use the national treasury. Hovering over the option to build or expand a building will let you know whether the money can come from your investment pool or not, based again on your economic system. When possible, allow your investment pool to grow before spending the national treasury on buildings that your people would be willing to invest in and help build. Once built, a building will try to employ a full workforce so that it can maximize output. The pops it hires depends on the type of building it is and the production methods you've set. These production methods also determine what the output of the building is, or what inputs it uses to produce them, typically locked by technology or policies. For example, A maize farm can sacrifice some of the grain it produces to increase the production of fruits and sugar, or wine. And a wheat farm using harvesting tools as a production method will start using tools, adding them to the input cost, but the increased output and changes in employment might result in a higher weekly balance than before, as long as the new input goods aren't prohibitively expensive. Keep an eye out for employment changes when making these adjustments. The types of POPs buildings employ and fire has a ripple effect as it impacts the wealth of the newly employed and newly unemployed POPs alike, potentially affecting their standard of living, changing which interest groups they might join, weakening or strengthening the clout of said interest groups, and ultimately influencing your policymaking options. Every building aims to maintain a full workforce while also trying to maintain profitability. If you want a business to be profitable, you'll want to minimize the cost of all of its inputs while maximizing the price of the goods it produces and sells. The balance between the two sides here will determine the weekly balance, and from that balance, some of the money will go into the owner's hands in the forms of dividends, while the rest will go into the business's cash reserves. The higher the weekly balance, the higher the building's productivity. And the higher the building's productivity, the more likely it is to raise wages in order to hold on to its workforce or to attract new employees. Remember, POPs will move from job to job, type to type, and state to state in the pursuit of a higher standard of living and better wages. Expanding a building will increase the number of people it employs and the amount of goods it produces, and for most buildings, it also increases the throughput by 1% per level up to a national capacity, with additional modifiers adjusting throughput even further. There are 3 different decrees you can use to bolster the throughput of buildings of various categories too. Enacting these decrees costs 100 authority apiece, but they can make a world of difference. Throughput represents how effectively the input goods are converted into output goods, and so it directly impacts profitability of a building too. The higher the throughput of a building, the more it makes for each pound it spends. Oftentimes, though, this expansion and subsequent increase in throughput will result in the market being flooded with the goods the building produces, which will reduce the price at which the good can be sold. You can find ways to keep the cost of the input and output goods in check to make sure the building stays profitable, but for that, you'll need to understand markets and trade. The market and how trade works is a very meaty topic, and we'll be diving into it in much greater depth in a follow-up video, but for today I want to touch on the absolute core systems that you need to understand to make sure your economy doesn't implode. The first thing to understand is supply and demand. Sell orders represent the supply of a good, while buy orders represent the demand for it. The balance between the two determines whether the market price is higher or lower than the typical price of the good in question, and this icon represents a shortage that is having a negative impact on one or more of your production chains specifically. Much like the real world, if there's a lot of demand for something but very little of it available, that thing becomes more expensive, indicated by stacks of gold coins in the game. On the flip side, if there's a lot more of something available than people want, prices usually drop, from expensive gold to average silver to cheap copper. It's important to note that these prices are averaged across the entire market. Each state within the market will have its own local price that you can see by clicking on the good and scrolling down, or by hovering over the relevant coin stack. Local prices are affected by local supply and demand, and based on market access resulting from infrastructure as discussed previously, but also relying on unhindered and unrated access to the market capital via C nodes if a land route doesn't exist. The averages give you enough actionable data, and only every so often will you notice a major outlier that needs to be resolved at a state level. You can even use the provided map modes to see what goods can be produced where they're already being produced, and where they're being consumed. As we touched on previously, prices going up and down will impact how much money POPs need to spend on their needs, impacting their wealth and standard of living, and beyond that, price fluctuations will impact the operating costs, resulting profits, and resulting wages at various buildings too. Fluctuating prices can also impact how much money the government is spending on goods, weapons for your armies, ships for your ports and naval bases, construction material for your construction sectors, paper for your bureaucratic buildings, so on and so forth. The market tab will show you which goods are currently in your market, but you should note that your market is different from your nation. A market can include many nations within it, all sharing access to and contributing to the same pool of goods, with POPs able to migrate between nations in the same market. The total supply and demand for any good in a market, then, is a sum of the supply and demand for those goods within all of the nations in that market. To add a nation to your market, you can try to make them your subject or protectorate, or you can invite them to join your customs union. Any of these options will keep you as the market leader, giving you certain benefits like an increased share of any consumption taxes collected in the market, the option to move the market capital around, and the option to embargo other markets. You can, instead, choose to join as a member of a customs union with a nation other than your own as the leader. While this might strip you of certain powers, it will give you access to the pool of goods in the market you just joined, possibly making a huge impact to the cost and sale price of various goods without needing to invest in trade. Trade takes place between markets, not nations. You cannot import or export goods to nations within your market. You cannot trade with markets whose leaders have declared an embargo on yours or vice versa, and you cannot trade with a market you cannot reach. You must be able to travel from your own market capital to the targets, either by sea from coastal state to coastal state as long as those coastal states have ports built in them, or by land through shared borders between your markets as long as there is a contiguous connection from those borders to your market capitals. Note, these shared borders are not national borders, but market borders instead. Additionally, you can only trade with markets if either of the market leaders have an interest in a region where either of the markets holds territory. We'll discuss interests further in the next section, but if you want to trade with a market, make sure either they have an interest in a region you hold territory in, or make sure to declare your own interest in a region where they hold some territory. Your trade policy determines whether you can trade in the first place and how tariffs and other systems apply too. Isolationists cannot trade at all, while other trade policies allow for trade, but bear in mind that each trade route costs some bureaucracy to maintain, unless you have a trade agreement with the market leader of the market you're trading with. As such, it's a good idea to get trade agreements with markets that you rely heavily on as a trading partner. Remember that the Market tab only shows you goods that are already in your market. Clicking the Trade lens and going to the Import or Export tabs will show you all physical goods, and clicking through to the Details screen will allow you to see state-level prices of said goods if you want. With a good selected from your market screen, you can adjust your market policy for that specific good as well. The default taxes both imports and exports, but you can choose to encourage exports or protect domestic supply, charging higher tariffs when the good is being imported to or exported from your market respectively, putting that extra money, of course, straight into the treasury in the form of tariffs. Trade is a business like any other, and so trade centers will consider their profitability when choosing how much of a good to import or export. Tariffs are applied on both ends of a trade, and since tariffs are paid for by the trade center managing a relevant trade route, if export tariffs are high, it is less likely to export too much of that good, and if import tariffs are high, it is less likely to import too much of that good. You can also eliminate tariffs with a specific trade partner completely by getting a trade agreement with the market leader. This exemption to tariffs applies to all goods traded with that one market, and again, the agreement removes the bureaucracy cost of routes between the markets too. Make sure to balance your tariffs against how much you actually want the goods in or out of your market. Don't discourage trade centers from doing what you want them to do by eating into their profits by too much when they do it. When you finally select a good to trade, you'll see a list of markets that are open to the interaction. You'll see an indication of the highest level that trade route will reach over time as determined by how many convoys are available, if there's enough demand for the good to be imported on the receiving end, and if the route would remain profitable for the trade center managing it, as we'll discuss in a bit. You'll also see the total amount of actual goods that will be traded at that level, and how many convoys would be needed for the route. 0 for land routes, exceedingly more and more for overseas routes that ship larger quantities of goods, typically at higher levels, and over larger distances, denoted by how many sea nodes it must travel through. Convoys are produced by ports, but the ports aren't the buildings actually doing the trading. That is handled by trade centers, a type of building whose, again, profitability is determined by the predicted trade revenue after tariffs have been taken, shown here as an amount per employee. Trade centers cannot be commissioned directly by you. Instead, they're built as and when needed when you create new trade routes, either for import or export. The size of a trade center is the sum of the levels of all the trade routes it manages, and as with other buildings, bigger means more employees, more urbanization, etc., etc. You can indirectly influence where trade centers are situated, as they typically appear in states with ports and in market capitals. Another differentiator for trade centers is that they are built and expanded instantaneously. You do not need to spend multiple weeks or construction resources to get them up and running. This is one of the reasons why it can often be better to simply import essential goods rather than try to produce them yourself. Local production involves a heavy investment, including a time investment, while importing the goods will free those resources up for other types of production that you can use to employ the kinds of pops you want to encourage, make the kinds of goods that help enrich the types of pops you want to enrich, and so on and so forth. Trade centers generate revenue through the trade of the goods flowing through them, but sometimes you'll have to take on less profitable or entirely unprofitable trade routes for the sake of meeting your people's or business's needs, again as described in multiple previous sections. Make sure you balance those less ideal trade routes out with profitable ones to prevent your trade centers from shutting down and to keep the employees at the trade centers well paid. Apart from trade routes you start, you'll see notifications for trade routes made by others as well, tapping into your market to import or export goods from or into. This is just other nations doing the same thing you're doing when you're looking to trade goods. You won't be able to cancel these trade routes from other nations, though you can always cancel the ones you started yourself. You can always opt to embargo nations you want to prevent trade happening with. You can also force nations to open their markets up to you or the world entirely, and you can cripple nations by flooding their markets with goods their economies are reliant on, or by devastating their shipping lanes. But for all that, we need to discuss interests, diplomacy, and escalation. You can only have diplomatic relations with other nations if you share a border, or if you both have an interest in the same strategic region. The strategic region's map mode breaks down what these are, and if you open your diplomacy tab, you'll see which regions you've got interests in. Controlling any non-colonial state within a strategic region automatically generates an interest in it, but you can declare interests in other strategic regions too, as long as you can reach it either by land or by sea. Your country's rank determines how many interests you can declare, but naval bases add to this number too, based on their productivity. The more productive they are, the more they add. Keep in mind, when you declare or remove an interest, it takes some time for the change to happen, and for trade and diplomacy with markets and nations in the region to become available. While we won't go into what every single diplomacy option means in today's video, it's important to note that many of these options require certain technology to be unlocked, many of them require the parties to be in customs unions, and almost all of them cost influence to maintain, while declaring a rivalry will generate influence instead, and others still have no associated maintenance cost, instead happening instantly. The current relations between two nations impact the likelihood or even option of some diplomatic actions being taken. You cannot establish an embargo against a nation with whom your relationship isn't at or below poor, for example, while having positive relations will add modifiers to the acceptance chance of deals like trade agreements and joining customs unions. You can always use improve and damage relations to change relations, while expelling diplomats is a fast way to decrease relations too, and having ongoing diplomatic options can also shift relations over time. Allies tend to improve relations over time, while rivals will see them deteriorate instead. Diplomacy also involves diplomatic plays. These are more akin to demands that you're making that you're willing to use military force for. Every diplomatic play starts with the opening moves phase, where both sides can add additional war goals at the cost of maneuvers. This also is when troops can start mobilizing. Next comes diplomatic maneuvers, where either side can choose to simply capitulate or to sway countries to their side using additional maneuvers, relying on said countries' relations with either sides and plans in the region to convince them. Only countries with an interest in the region can be swayed by either party, though alliances and defensive pacts can draw nations in regardless. Then there's the countdown to war, and finally, if neither side backs down, war erupts, allowing you to raid your enemy's shipping lanes, hurting their supply of goods and trade going through the shipping lanes, while also fighting at land and sea. War is a completely different beast in Victoria 3, and so rather than condensing it here today, we'll do a deep dive into war for our next video releasing on this channel tomorrow. Make sure you subscribe to know when it releases, and feel free to join the Discord linked in the description down below for help, or if you're looking for folks to play with too. With these essential tips in the bag though, you should have a basic understanding of the most important concepts in Victoria 3. If you enjoyed this video, don't hesitate to hit that like button and leave a comment down below, and if you have anything in particular you'd like to see covered in depth on the channel, let me know in the comments, or ask away in the Discord, again linked in the description. Remember to subscribe for more Victoria 3 content, including guides, live streams, let's plays, and more. And as always, a massive thanks goes out to all of the channel members and patrons who've been supporting the channel on a monthly basis. Y'all keep us alive and running smoothly. And of course, a big ol' thanks goes out to each and every one of you for watching. Until next time, cheers.